So we're installing sliders on a four-door Bronco. These are the Metaltech 4x4 sliders. This set happens to be our Sidewinder sliders. We also have our step sliders as well, but the Sidewinders are going to go on. If your truck has factory running rails or rock rails that forward bolts to the body, you're going to want to pull those off first, and then go ahead and put the real rock sliders on that bolt to the frame. So we're going to introduce the hardware pack. This hardware pack has a couple of unique things in it, but I have them grouped on the table here for the left side slider and the right side slider. So we're going to start with the left side slider, so the driver's side slider. That's going to be using these 1/2" 13, these longer bolts that are 1/2" 13. When I say longer, passenger side does have some shorter ones. There's short bolts on the passenger side, so there's two shorter ones, that's passenger side. So in the front of the truck, we're going to be using this longer through bolt. We're going to be having a washer on each head. We're going to have a washer against the large washer, which goes to the inside of the frame, lock washer, and a lock nut. And that repeats the middle foot, uses a smaller washer on the inside of the frame, a washer at the head of the bolt, and then lock washer and lock nut. And then same thing in the back, just like the front, it's going to be using a washer on the bolt, it's going to go through the frame, large washer on the inside, and then washer, lock nut. And then on the underside of the frame, again on the driver's side, in the front, if you don't have a factory skid plate, you'll need this little cage nut. We include it, little metric one. We have a little metric bolt for it and lock washer. And this is for the front mount. If you have a factory skid plate or aftermarket skids already, you'll already be having something like this on your truck as it is. You can use what you already have, or you can go to one of these. This cage nut is actually stronger than what Ford puts on the trucks. And then as you go back on the underside, the middle foot and the rear foot on the very bottom part of the frame utilizes these two metric 12mm by 175 thread pitch bolts that go into the frame on the underside. Now moving over to the right side slider. The right side slider consists of the very front foot is mounting using the exact same through bolt system, where the bolt's going to have a washer on it. It's going to go through the frame. Backside's going to have a large washer, lock washer, nut, and that's how that's going to go together. When you go to the middle and the rear, we're going to be using these lollipop nuts. Now these are special ones that we make that have a locking bolt in them, and it has one side is flush and one side has the nut recessed. And we're going to actually be putting the recessed nut part into a hole in the back side of the frame, and we'll show you on the video how to use those. And then these are what's using the shorter 1/2" 13 bolts, and they get a single washer on the head, and then they go through and then they go into those lock bolts on there. And then on the right side of the truck, we utilize the 3 bolts that are already on the truck that hold your fuel tank skid or fuel tank strap mounting system on. So that's the underside bolts for the other side. So we're going to start off by popping the wiring harness on these mounts for the loom away from the frame. I'm going to use an actual tool made for that, but you can use a screwdriver, and they just pop out. They're just little Christmas tree mounts. And I'm going to pop them free for now, and then I'll come back and pop the ones in that can go ahead and stand when we're done. But I'm just going to go down the frame and pull these out. So we have our front mount on the slider. We're going to look at where it goes on the frame first. And as it's going to come up, this top hole here is going to go through this big hole in the frame right here. And then this lower hole here is notched, and it's actually going to go right where the skid plate is currently mounted. Now this is a prototype. This is a Metaltech prototype. It's been on here for just shy of a year. In all of our testing, that's why it's all massively beat up. But if you have the standard Badlands or any of the versions that have the stock skid plates, they mount in the exact same spot, and this works with the skid plates. It's not a problem. It easily works with the skid plates. You're going to back the screws down, the bolts down, and then this is going to come up and slide. And since we've notched this, it's going to slide right in there for you to be able to tighten those back down again. And then we're going to run a through bolt up here through the frame, and we'll show you the back side of that. So the midfoot's going to come in, and there's this nice threaded mount on the frame that is already existing. We're going to use that, and then there's another through hole up top that we're going to put another cross bolt on the inside, going across from one side to the other on the slider. So again, continuing on the driver's side, we're now at the back, very furthest back mount. This mount's going to use the existing threaded hole in the frame here. And then we have a big through hole at the top that's going to go through all the way through the frame on the other side. And being a double box frame, it's a really strong spot for that. So now we have our different locations. Again, this is the driver's side and the back. This is a Badlands, so it came with the factory skids. And the factory skids come with these little cage nuts that are just little clip cage nut things that will slide in the frame and then go into that hole. And then there's the screws that hold them on hold the skid plate to the frame. And of course, the clip itself is not holding the skid plate. It really is the bolt and the nut on the back side. The little cage just holds the nut in place. So there's two of them. There's one in the front, one in the back. For trucks that have factory skid plates, you're just going to reuse the factory stuff. If you don't have that, our kit includes a little cage nut that's designed to go in there, and then one of the little bolts that's designed for that as well. So if you don't have that, and I'm going to act like we don't, we're just going to put that one up like that so it's loose, and now our slider is going to slide in, and since it's notched, it's going to slide right over that so we can bolt that down. If you have the factory skid or an aftermarket skid, just lower this part down, slide the slider mount between the skid plate and the frame, and then tighten it back down again. And the skid plate will totally work with this because it's going to be sitting right on top of that slider. So now you're going to use one of the threaded or the flange bolts. This is a metric flange bolt, and it is a 12-175 flange. So we're going to take that. We're going to put the one of the basically 1/2 inch or 12 millimeter washers on it, and it's going to come up through the bottom, and it's going to go right into the exact existing threaded hole in the frame. We've got these really nice threaded holes that we're going to go into. Now, this is the same thing that we're going to do in the midfoot. All right, so now we're going to use one of the long through frame bolts. We're going to put, it's a 1/2 inch 13 bolt. We're going to put a 1/2 inch washer on it. It's going to come up. Now, this is just resting right now. It's kind of lower than where it's going to be, but we can still get it in. We're going to come up, pass it through where it goes completely through the frame. We want to make sure it's not hanging up on the wiring harness or the brake lines at all. Okay, next one, we got our lower bolt in. And we got another long bolt we're going to go. We're going to same thing, long bolt. We're going to put a washer on it, and it's going to come up and go through the frame hole, clear through to the other side, ready for the bolts on the back side. So before we put the bolt through in the back, we got this brake line here, and it's on a little Christmas tree mount. I'm going to come in and release that and pull it away, put the mount off the side, just so we can get everything all bolted up. And we're done. We'll come back, stick it back in there, and if we need to clearance the line by bending the line slightly, we will. So now we're going to do the rear one, through bolt. Again, washer. We're going to put that on there on the through bolt. Come up, pass through, goes right through to the other side. So the bolt's through. We're going to take one of the really large washers, bring that up, and put that through. That's going to give us a nice support. And this is a doubled frame, so this area up here is actually a double box, and we're bolting it right next to that double box. So it's a really strong spot. Next, we're going to put a regular washer, and then we're going to put a lock washer on. And once that's on, we're going to come back and take one of our locking 1/2 inch 13 bolts and get it started on there. And so it's ready to be tightened down. So we're going to come into the front. We're going to have a very large washer that's going to come in here. This is a big heavy duty one. It's going to distribute the load, and it fits right in that recessed area perfectly. And we're going to put a regular washer on it, and then a lock washer, and then we're going to come in with one of our lock nuts, and this is a nylock nut as well, and that's going to give us the anti-rattle and also keep us from having to over torque that when we put it on. All right, so on this one we're going to put not just one, but we're going to put 2 washers on this one. We're going to put a lock washer on, and then we're going to come back with our nylock nut and get ready to tighten that down. All right, so we have our slider in. Again, this is a skid plate mount for the trucks that will come with factory skids, or if you're running aftermarket skid. And it's going to have one here and one here. So there's the other cage nut. Again, this truck is a Badlands. It came with factory skids. So you're going to have this piece for the skid plate then to be sitting on. The skid plate's going to come up and touch this. And then, because the slider needs to actually have this up against the frame for the strength of the slider for its mounting. And as far as the skid plate goes, the skid plate's just pushing up. And so the big flange of a skid plate is actually pushing up. That's what makes the skid plates really strong. So in those cases where you have this other cage nut and bolt that's in there, in our kit we have extra 1/2 inch washers. And you're just going to take 3 of those washers and you're going to put those up there. When you put your skid plate back on, you're going to bolt that back up, and that'll compensate for the thickness of that 1/4 inch plate that the slider is using for mounting there. And that just makes the skid plate sit cleanly up against the frame, and there's no gap or anything like that on it. So you're going to notice on all of the mounting feet, there's these extra little holes, these little 1/4 inch holes that are in here. We use those for fixturing when we're holding the plates, when we do everything, all the weld up. So when you see these extra little holes, don't feel that you have to there's supposed to be something there. That's just for us to hold these plates in place when we weld the entire slider. The main thing is those large holes and the slot. Those are the big ones that we're going to actually be using. So don't think that you're missing something by having those little holes there. It's not hurting anything. They're just along for the ride. So now I'm going to go back and start snugging everything up. I'm going to start at the bottom on all of the bottom mounts. I'm going to push those up. That's going to put the slider up in its ride position. And then we'll come back and then we'll start tightening down the cross bolt. These cross bolts don't have to be Gorilla tight. You don't have to get in here and just Gorilla tighten the snot out of them. It is a hollow frame in some areas. Other areas are double box, like this back area is double box. I'll reinforce the third one in the back, so I'll reinforce. This one up here is reinforced because the transfer case mounting bracket is there. So it's a very strong area, but we don't need to go 75 foot-pounds on these things. We're going to take them to like maybe 20. The key thing that's holding them in place, of course, is going to be the nylox. The locking nuts are what's holding those in place, so we don't have to torque those suckers down. That one's about where I like it. I'm going to go ahead and work our way back to the next one. So again, on the frame, this through bolt, only about 20 foot-pounds, all we need. I'm just snugging it down nice and tight. So this back one, I've got the bolt in place. You have some ability to bring it up and down a little bit, so I kind of set it towards the upper part because that's a big, huge window that it's going through. And then we popped this little Christmas tree mount out of its little hole earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this back in again. And I can see it's somewhat close to the bolt, not super tight, but I'm going to go ahead and just use my hands, again, fingers only, to be able to bend this down just a little bit, give yourself a little bit of extra clearance. It's not going to hurt anything to doing that. If you use your fingers, you just put a slight little bend in that brake line. That'll give it some clearance, so there's no chance that it can rattle and come up and touch it. So this side is done. We're ready to do the other side. So we're going to put the passenger side slider on, and it goes up against the frame, and we use these really large, nice threaded 12 millimeter 175 anchored threads that are in the frame as the lower mounts, and then we have through bolts on the upper mounts. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to back off the front skid mount bolt here, and this is a factory skid on a Badlands. If you don't have the skids, you'll have the retaining plate, which does the same thing. It holds the fuel tank up. We're going to loosen the one in the front, and then these two in the back, we're going to actually go ahead and remove those. The fuel tank will stay where it's at. The other mounts do hold it with not a problem. We're just loosening the one in the front. We're going to give ourselves about a 3/8 of an inch away from the frame. And then these in the back we're going to completely remove. And the reason for that is when the slider slides on, the slider slides between the frame and the skid plate mount at the frame when we bolt it on. So I'm going to go ahead and pull these off and loosen this one in the front. So now the front bolt has been dropped down. It's still in there, still holding. These two have been removed. So the skid plate, either the stock one or aftermarket skid or a stock hanging system on the Bronco, can now drop down away from the frame with at least a 1/4 inch gap between the top of the skid and the frame, and that's going to allow the mounts on the slider to be able to slide between the frame and the skid plate. So the slider's up against the body. We've slipped each one of the mounting feet between the skid plate and the frame. So starting the front, we left the bolt slightly down with about a 3/8 gap, allowed us to be able to slide the 1/4 inch plate in. That mount is got a notch in it, so it can slide right in, makes it really easy. I'm going to go ahead and start snugging them down. I'm not going to fully tighten them. This is where the small bolts come in, or the shorter bolts. They're still 1/2 inch 13. But the two that are shorter are going to be used on the passenger side, rear, and middle mount. And then the longer one, which is just like the driver's side, this one is being used on the front mount. So we're going to use these two shorter ones first. So just put them next to each other. You'll see the two that are shorter. And these are going to be used with the lollipop nuts. And the lollipop nuts are these things right here. So the lollipop nut has two sides to it. There's a side that has the nut protruding out, and there's a side that's perfectly flat. And it's going to slide up between the fuel tank and up into the hole that's on the back side of the frame. Now when you slide this up, the fuel tanks float back and forth on the mounts. So sometimes the tank's a little more towards the frame, sometimes they're further away from the frame. It will, if the tank is close to the frame, this still will slide up between the tank and the frame. If it's not, you just can't quite get it, loosen all of the tank bolts, the skid plate bolts, and just reach up to the plastic tank and push the plastic tank over. You'll get about 3/8 of an inch of movement. The tank on this truck, I have more than enough room for this to go up between the tank. I'm not even touching the tank when I go up. So, but keep that in mind. If you have a tight fit when you're doing it, not a problem. The tank can slide over if you just loosen all the mounts, because the tank just sits on the mount. So I'm going to take this, slide it up to the window, and I'll put the bolt in through the frame to the stick nut. So that's where we take one of the shorter bolts, we put a washer on it, and we bring it up to the hole, pass it through, and then you're going to find the stick nut on the opposite side, and just go ahead and start threading the bolt into the stick nut. So I've got the through bolt on the stick nut, the lollipop nut, with the nut itself into the recess in the frame. And as I'm tightening the nut, or the bolt, the stick is going to want to rotate up. So I'm going to keep a hold on to it as I do it, so I don't have the stick completely go away where I can't get to it if I ever want to take the slider off. Otherwise, the stick nut is just sitting next to the fuel tank. It's long for the ride. But we've got that top bolt in. We'll go ahead and do the middle one now. Okay. So I've got the stick nut that I'm going to bring the nut facing outward, the flat facing towards the tank. I have it where it's sliding right up between the tank, and I can feel that nut go into the recessed hole. I have one of the short bolts with a washer on it. I'm going to run it through, straight back to the stick nut, and I'm going to go ahead and, or the lollipop nut, and get it started. And there it is. So I've got the bolt snugged down. The stick I have it going towards the front with this recess next to the skid. You could take this and bend this up out of the way if you'd like. I'm going to leave it hanging down for now. This one's in place. I'm not fully tightening it. It's just snugged up, and I'm ready to do the front one. So now we're going to take one of the longer bolts, a washer, and we're going to take it and we're going to pass it through this hole in the frame, through to the other side, and then from the inside of the frame we're going to put the washers and nut on. So the bolt's going to come through, and this we're going to use one of the really large washers. Put that on, and then with the really large washer in place, we're going to go ahead and put the lock nut directly on there and get that started. And once that's started, now we can come in and start snugging that down. And we don't need to go really tight on these, just like the other ones. So only about, if you're doing it by torque, maybe about 20 foot-pounds, not a lot. They're going to self-lock because we're using locking nuts on everything. Once we got everything snugged up, we're going to come back and then tighten everything down. But this one's ready to be snugged up. So everything's in, all the bolts are in place, slider's in place. We're going to go back now and just go ahead and snug everything, or tighten everything down, ready for the trail. Again, through the through bolts, we're not going to go crazy on. They are reinforced, these middle sections. Front one is an area that we're not going to put a lot of force on that. We're going to snug that one down and let the locking systems work on all of them. But everything else will be tightened down. All the lower bolts will be tightened down. I'll check the other side as well, just to make sure it's all really good to go. And the truck's ready for the trail. Now, after I run the truck for about 200 miles, I'm going to come back and I'm going to check all the bolts just to make sure that nothing's backed off a little bit. So we have the everything back on the truck, and we went ahead and put our prototype skid plate back on. Works just fine with the sliders. Everything's showing the same real estate here, but the skid plate is actually mounted to the bottom part of the slider. And I put two little washers between the frame and the skid plate here to space it down a little bit, just to keep it level. Everything tightens up and everything works just fine. So it's all ready to go.